Can you believe the sheer, terrifying audacity of what unfolded deep within the frozen, bone-crushing heart of the Scandinavian mountains, 1,000 years before electricity illuminated the sheer scale of their isolation? This is not just a story of snow. This is the chronicle of a catastrophe no one saw coming. An event so utterly annihilating that it shattered the very Norse sagas, forcing the few survivors to bury the truth under layers of ice and agonizing silence. For these were the forgotten people, huddled against the relentless, suffocating darkness of the long winter, far from the coastal fjords where the famous longships danced. They were the mountain folk, the ones who wrestled their meager existence directly from the unforgiving hand of the primordial wilderness, believing that the true gods resided not in Valhalla, but in the thunder that split the ancient frozen pines right outside their doors. They knew the cold was their enemy, the darkness their constant companion. But what stalked them on that infamous night, the night the snow turned to blood, was something far older, far more intelligent, and infinitely more monstrous than any blizzard ever could be. It was the middle of the Mørketid, the season of permanent, crushing twilight, around 850 CE. The small cluster of farmsteads, barely 7 timber longhouses carved into the mountainside, was preparing for the deepest freeze. They had secured the livestock, banked the fires, and were relying entirely on stockpiled smoked meat and the flickering light of tallow lamps to survive the next 3 months. Imagine the silence, not the quiet of peace, but the dense, heavy silence of absolute vacuum, broken only by the crackle of fat in the hearth and the distant, mournful howl of a lone wolf, a sound that always carried the flavor of impending doom. The air itself felt brittle, sharp enough to slice skin. Outside, the snow was piled higher than the roofs, transforming the world into a maze of white tunnels and treacherous drifts. Everyone was inside, gathered around the central fire pits, telling the old familiar tales of Fimbulwinter, the great winter that precedes Ragnarok. They needed comfort. They were about to receive terror. The first sign was not a scream. A scream implies warning, a chance to react. No, the first sign was the sudden, impossible absence of sound. Old Leif, the patriarch, a man whose beard was permanently frosted and whose eyes held the wisdom of 90 winters, felt it first. The subtle thrum of the earth beneath the packed dirt floor, a vibration that usually accompanied the deep, rhythmic breathing of the mountain itself, vanished. It was replaced by a chilling, unnatural stillness that seemed to suck the very heat from the air. He stood up, his joints protesting with painful cracks, and moved toward the heavy, iron-bound door, his hand resting instinctively on the polished handle of his ancient battle axe, Frost Eater. He had seen many things in his long life: famine, war, the pale shapes of winter sickness. But this felt like the world had paused just to watch them burn. Can you even begin to comprehend the psychological horror of being trapped in total sensory deprivation, knowing that something massive is moving just meters away, yet seeing absolutely nothing? The wind, which had been a constant, aggressive force for weeks, died instantaneously, leaving the air thick and heavy, like breathing cold oil. The few surviving sheep in the attached barn suddenly went completely silent, a silence more alarming than any panicked bleating. Then came the smell. Not the smell of fire or smoke, or even the familiar scent of wolf. It was a metallic, almost coppery stench, laced with something ancient, damp, and overwhelmingly powerful. The smell of freshly spilled blood, mixed with the deep, musky odor of undisturbed earth that had been ripped open too violently. Life threw open the door. The immediate blast of frigid air should have been overwhelming, yet his mind barely registered the cold. His eyes, adjusted to the interior darkness, strained against the absolute blackness outside, which was now strangely deeper, absorbing the weak moonlight that occasionally pierced the cloud cover. He saw the tracks first, massive, disturbing depressions in the pristine snow, tracks that no known beast of the north could make. They were too heavy, too evenly spaced, and they led directly away from the farmstead, dragging a wide, smooth trough behind them, as if something enormous had been pulled, not pushed. And then the true horror. The snow was no longer white. It was stained in streaks of crimson, so dark they looked black in the dim light, tracing a jagged line back toward the edge of the impenetrable pine forest that guarded the highest slopes. Leif didn't need to see the body to know what happened to young Torvin, the stable hand who had taken the late shift watching the livestock. He knew with a certainty that froze his heart harder than the surrounding glaciers that Torvin was gone, dragged into the void, consumed by a nightmare that should only exist in the whispers of frightened children. This was not a quick raid by rival clansmen seeking provisions. This was surgical, silent, and terrifyingly efficient. Whatever had struck had not come for plunder, it had come for meat. And it was still out there, hiding in the monumental shadows of the longest night, waiting for the rest of them to step outside. The farmstead was sealed tight, but the terror was already inside, breathing down their necks. Leif slammed the heavy door shut, dropping the iron bar with a deafening clang that echoed the frantic beating of his own heart. He turned to face his family, his sons, his daughters, their wives, and the wide-eyed, trembling grandchildren, their faces pale and spectral in the firelight. He held up Frost Eater, its steel catching the orange glow, and his voice, usually a deep rumble, was a ragged whisper laced with granite. "It is not the winter we fear anymore," he rasped, the words catching in the frozen air. Something ancient has woken. We are trapped, isolated, and whatever took Torvin is watching every single gap in the timber. We are its prey, and the long night has just begun. The children whimpered. The women wept silently into their woolen cloaks, and the men gripped their axes, their minds racing. How do you fight an enemy you cannot see? An enemy that thrives in the very darkness that is meant to protect you. This, friends, is where the epic of the snow-bound nightmare truly begins. They thought they knew the rules of survival in the 9th century North. They were tragically, horrifyingly wrong. Prepare yourselves, because the walls of this long house are about to become their final, bloody tomb. The morning, if you could even call that perpetual, bruising gray a morning during the deep mørketid, did not break. It simply bled into existence. Thorkel, the hard-bitten patriarch, whose beard was usually frosted with the rime of industry, stood frozen on the threshold of the longhouse, his breath clouding out like the ghost of his own terror. He was the first to see the impossible truth etched into the newly fallen snow, and that sight shattered his 50 years of mountain wisdom in an instant. The silence was the loudest, most suffocating sound they had ever heard. The predictable chaos of the farm, the lowing of the aurochs, the anxious snuffling of the pigs, the constant, irritating yelping of the Norwegian elk hounds was gone. Replaced by a stillness so complete, it felt like the world outside the longhouse had ceased to exist, frozen solid by a horror too great for sound. They had already identified the first missing one, little Astrid, barely 7 years old, who had ventured to the woodpile just before the protective curfew. They followed her tiny, perfect boot prints until they stopped, abruptly, terrifyingly, in a small, immaculate clearing near the stand of skeletal birch trees. There was no blood, no struggle, no drag marks, nothing to indicate violence. It was as if she had simply ceased to be, plucked from the earth by an invisible, impossibly swift hand. But then Thorkel saw the tracks, and the hair stood up on his neck like iron filings to a magnet. These were not the prints of wolves, heavy with hunger, nor the clumsy shuffle of a giant mountain bear roused from hibernation. These were massive, three-toed impressions, deeply set into the compacted snow, each one spanning the length of a man's torso. They were too heavy for any creature known to Norse myth, yet they possessed a chilling, impossible quality. The pattern would run for maybe 15 paces, clear and distinct, and then simply vanish. Vanish without a flutter of disturbance, without a mound of thrown snow, as if the immense weight had suddenly, impossibly, taken flight straight upward into the frozen void. Thorkel's mind, which usually dealt only in iron, fire, and the brutal arithmetic of survival, flashed back to the oldest, most terrifying sagas, Tales of the Vatir, the things that moved between worlds, creatures that didn't walk the earth, but merely touched it when convenient. Panic immediately became a viral infection, spreading through the remaining 23 souls crammed into the smoke-filled, single-room dwelling. They were trapped inside the relentless, crushing darkness of the Murkatid, where the sun had retreated to the underworld for months, leaving them exposed to an unending night that now served as the perfect, limitless hunting ground. The men rushed to reinforce the great oak door, a defensive slab that had repelled blizzards, petty raiders, and even the occasional hungry Jotun wolf over the decades. They drove iron spikes into the frame, wedged heavy timbers across the latch, trying to stop the unstoppable with mere wood and metal. A desperate, futile gesture against something that ignored physical barriers entirely. "It is the shadow beast of the frost giants," screamed the oldest woman, Helga, her eyes wide and staring into the high rafters, seeing ghosts in the drying meats hanging above. "The Skuga Skepna. It comes when the land is coldest, when the line between Midgard and Niflheim is thinnest." Her words, though steeped in superstitious dread, held a terrifying logic. This was not a human enemy they could fight with axes and shields. This thing was leveraging the environment, using the bone-cracking cold and the oppressive dark as its armor and its weapon simultaneously. They huddled closer to the fire pit, their only source of heat and light. But the mighty blaze seemed diminished, its cheerful roar replaced by a sputtering anxiety. The ambient temperature inside the longhouse began to drop, not gradually, but in sudden, violent lurches, as if something enormous and cold was breathing just outside the walls. They tried to rationalize, to blame a crazed bear or a pack of enormous starved wolves, but the pristine, impossible tracks outside defied all explanation. They knew, in the deepest, most primal chamber of their hearts, that the predator was highly efficient, supremely intelligent, and completely non-human. The internal structure began to fracture under the pressure of existential fear. Whispers turned into accusations. Who had failed to latch the goat pen? Was the tragedy punishment for a hidden sin? Brother eyed brother, and the communal warmth of the longhouse dissolved into isolated islands of frantic, self-preserving terror. Then, late that endless afternoon, when the darkness deepened from deep indigo to absolute, crushing black, the seismic vibration began. It wasn't a sound that hit their ears first. It was a physical force that vibrated through the frozen rock beneath the longhouse. A low, subsonic groan that rattled the iron pots hanging near the fire. The tremor intensified, not like an earthquake, but like a massive weight pressing down on the mountain itself, centered right above their shelter. The rush of air outside grew into a howling gale, yet the source was utterly still. It was the movement of something vast, something ancient, repositioning itself in the eternal darkness. The fire, their life source, suddenly convulsed, shrinking violently inward against the logs, as if recoiling from an unbearable, primordial cold that had just been summoned. The Skugga was not just observing them, it was actively manipulating the atmosphere, freezing them in place. And then, a small, wet, scraping sound came from the high vent in the ceiling, a sound that suggested heavy, razor-sharp claws testing the weakest point of their final, fragile defense. The hunt was resuming. The longhouse was officially breached. The longhouse roof did not just crack, it imploded. A shower of frozen sod, ancient timber, and fine, icy dust rained down upon the huddled family, extinguishing the fragile glow of the central hearth just as the thing descended. It wasn't a slow drop. It was a collapsing mass of unimaginable weight and speed, slamming into the earth floor, where young Astrid had been sleeping mere hours before. Silence. A silence far heavier and more absolute than the roaring storm outside, broken only by the ragged, terrified gasps of the survivors pressed against the back wall. The smoke from the dying fire momentarily shielded their eyes, but the air itself, thick, metallic, and utterly wrong, was a map to the predator's location. Olaf, his heart beating a frantic drum against his ribs, raised the broad-bladed axe he had carried since his 14th winter, the iron cold and uselessly light in his shaking grip. He could hear it moving, a sickening scrape of bone against dirt, testing the unfamiliar terrain of the human dwelling. It wasn't walking like a man or bounding like a wolf. It flowed low to the ground, an invisible torrent of muscle and predatory intent, focused entirely on the scent of warm, living blood. Two pairs of desperate eyes, those of Olaf and his aging cousin Styr, stared uselessly into the absolute void. Then came the sound of rending flesh, but not human flesh. It had found the smoked boar carcass hanging near the storage alcove, a massive, preparatory meal before the main course. This pause, this momentary distraction, was the only gift the gods granted them. Styr seized the opportunity, shoving a sputtering tallow lamp tied to a pole toward the massive hole in the ceiling, illuminating the scene for a split, agonizing second. What they saw defies any saga, any myth whispered around a winter fire. It was too large, too angular, too wrong to be anything born of the Midgard forest. It was a silhouette of impossible geometry, massive shoulders hunched over its prey, gleaming teeth ripping through hide and bone with the efficiency of a stone mill. But the light, fragile as it was, gave Olaf a target. He roared, a sound more desperate than brave, and threw his axe with every ounce of his remaining strength. The heavy iron spun true, not hitting the creature's head, but sinking deep into the upper flank, eliciting a sound that was not a howl, but a shriek of scraping metal against stone, a sound that tore at the very fabric of the longhouse timbers. The predator reacted instantly, abandoning the boar and turning with impossible swiftness, a blur against the darkness. It was furious, wounded, and now perfectly aware of the source of the pain. Steer didn't even have time to scream. The creature moved past the flickering lamp, and all Olaf heard was the sickening, wet crunch of bone snapping, followed by the sound of Steer's body being violently pulled into the darkness toward the vent hole. Olaf stood alone, his breath frozen in his lungs, listening to the muffled, awful sounds above him as the creature retreated with its prize, using the same passage it had forced open. The whole engagement had lasted less than 10 heartbeats, and already another defender was gone, dragged into the frozen world outside, utterly consumed by the Fimbulwinter's new hunter. But the attack was a calculated, terrifying feint. The thing had not fled, it had merely repositioned. They had learned a terrible truth. This creature was not hunting for sustenance alone. It was studying their defenses, testing their resolve, treating the longhouse like a complex puzzle it intended to dismantle, piece by agonizing piece. Olaf could feel the vibrations through the packed dirt floor. It was moving under the structure now, using the deep snowdrifts as cover, circling the very foundations of their home. The thick walls of woven wattle and clay, designed to keep out the wind and the common wolf, were nothing more than wet parchment to whatever ancient horror now stalked them. He stumbled back to where his wife, Liv, shielded their 2 terrified children. He grabbed a handful of pitch-soaked kindling and shoved it into the embers of the hearth, desperately trying to bring the fire back to life. Light was their only friend, their only chance to see the true face of the encroaching horror before it consumed them all. The small flame sputtered, caught, and then surged, casting monstrous, dancing shadows across the remaining wall. In the sudden illumination, Olaf saw the evidence of the creature's passage into the longhouse. Not just the gaping hole above, but a trail of thick, dark fluid. Not exactly blood, but something viscous and faintly phosphorescent, leading toward the eastern wall. He knew the eastern wall was the weakest. It was nearest the midden pit, built over the oldest section of the farmstead. He screamed at Liv to pull the children away, toward the central pillar, the structural spine of the building, where the logs were thickest. As Liv scrambled, pulling the whimpering boys, the eastern wall bulged. It groaned under a sudden, focused pressure from the outside, the sound of ancient earth giving way. This time there was no subtlety, no reconnaissance. The creature was smashing its way in, forcing a massive, irreversible entry point. Olaf grabbed the longest spear remaining, blessed only with a crude iron head, and positioned himself directly in front of the collapsing wall. He knew this was the end of the line. If he failed to stop this charge, there would be nothing left of his family but bones scattered in the morning snow. He planted his heel deep in the dirt, took a final, ragged breath of the freezing, metallic air, and waited for the world to explode in teeth and claw. The timber shrieked, the clay burst inward, and a massive, coal-black arm, thick as a man's torso and tipped with dagger-length claws, ripped through the protective barrier, sweeping blindly but powerfully across the inner room. The attack was immediate, primal, and unstoppable.
Olaf didn't hesitate. He thrust the spear forward, aiming for the space where he believed the creature's shoulder met its chest, driving the iron point with every ounce of desperation he possessed into the unnatural darkness that was now consuming his home.
The iron point, honed sharp against the whetstone for endless winter evenings, did not pierce flesh or shatter bone. Instead, it met a resistance that defied the natural world, a dense, humming obsidian cold that instantly quenched the heat of the hearth and the heat of his desperate fury. There was no shriek of pain, only an impossible, deafening silence that rushed in to fill the moment of impact, followed by a shockwave of sheer, raw cold that slammed Rolf back against the stone hearth, his vision exploding into starbursts of crimson and black as the air was violently vacuumed from his lungs. The dagger was torn from his grip, not by muscle, but by a sudden gravitational pull from the creature's mass, embedding itself with a sickening thunk into the main support beam of the longhouse, where the dark sheen of whatever he had struck instantly began to consume the metal, dulling its shine and drawing the very life from the polished steel. He scrambled on the icy dirt floor, tasting blood and grit, his ears ringing with the phantom sound of that failed blow, knowing instantly that this was not a creature of flesh and blood, but something mined from the deepest, most frozen core of the Morkatid itself, a hunger given form. His wife, Gudrun, who had been sheltering terrified behind the loom, let out a choked sound of utter despair, the sound immediately swallowed by the colossal shadow that now momentarily paused, seemingly contemplating the insignificant scratch of the iron. Rolf didn't wait for the creature to complete its thought. Survival instincts, sharpened by generations spent fighting the merciless landscape, seized control. He knew the fight was lost the moment the iron failed. Now his only purpose was to carry the terrible knowledge to the nearest living soul. He ignored the searing pain in his ribs and the panicked screams that were now muffled and distant, reaching instead for the leather pouch containing his meager reserve of dried meat and the small bone-handled axe used for kindling, its head heavier and more reliable than any sword. The creature shifted, and the very structure of the longhouse groaned under the weight of its presence, the sound like a mountain calving ice, the darkness coalescing into a more defined shape, a grotesque silhouette, too broad and too low to be human, its extremities dissolving into the swirling black smoke that permeated the rafters. He saw a brief, impossible glimpse of where its eye might be, not a reflection, but an absorption of light, a pinprick void of absolute zero that promised oblivion. He kicked open the rear door, splintering the oak frame that had stood firm against 50 years of winter storms, throwing himself headlong into the maelstrom of the Fimble winter outside. The blizzard immediately assaulted him, the wind a physical blow, the snow fine and sharp like pulverized glass. But the cold outside was a warm bath compared to the lethal chill he had just fled. He ran blindly for 20 paces, then checked himself, plunging into a deep snowdrift near the woodpile, listening with every strained nerve for the sounds of pursuit. There was none. Only the white, roaring fury of the storm. This was worse than a chase. The creature hadn't pursued him because it didn't need to. It knew where he was going. Or perhaps it simply didn't care. It had already harvested what it came for. The realization was a paralyzing weight. He was not escaping a hunter. He was merely fleeing a predator that deemed him irrelevant. A messenger of doom sent out into the wilderness. His goal was Thorfinn's farm, 3 full leagues to the west, nestled against the frozen fjords. A journey that usually took 2 days of hard trekking in decent weather would now demand every ounce of his strength and luck, likely taking 3 or 4 days in this suffocating darkness, provided he didn't freeze solid by the morning. He gripped the small axe tighter, the wood warm against his frozen palm, a tenuous link to the human world he was leaving behind. He used the ancient knowledge of the land, avoiding the exposed peaks and trusting the small, protected gullies, where the pine trees offered a momentary shield against the relentless wind. He moved like a shadow himself, not daring to light the small tallow lamp he carried, knowing that any flicker of light would serve as a beacon to the thing he had just struck. He had to rely purely on memory, navigating by the ghost shapes of landmarks he hadn't seen clearly since the summer solstice. Hours passed, marked only by the increasing numbness in his feet and the desperate need to rub circulation back into his hands. He was nearing the halfway point, a cluster of enormous moss-covered granite boulders known as the Troll's Teeth, when he stumbled. He didn't fall on snow, but on something hard and unnaturally smooth. Scrabbling to regain his footing, he realized he had crossed a patch of earth where the snow had been completely scoured away, leaving behind frozen, bare rock that radiated an absolute, sterile cold. And then he saw it, the residue. Scattered across the blackened rock were not animal remains, but traces of something else. Pulverized wood fibers, small calcified shards that might have once been bone, and a metallic, oily dust that smelled faintly of copper and ozone. This wasn't merely a killing field. This was where the creature had processed its previous victims. The total annihilation, the lack of tracks, the impossible cold. It wasn't just physical strength. It was a fundamental force, a mechanism of complete removal. The iron dagger hadn't failed because the creature was armored. It failed because the creature was consuming the world around it, turning matter into cold energy. He pushed himself onward, the horror hardening into a cold, lethal resolve. If he could reach Thorfinn, if they could rally even a few men, they might stand a chance, not through strength, but perhaps through fire, or some ancient ritual that their ancestors had used to ward off the primordial dread that stalked the mountains in the deepest winter. But as he rounded the final boulder, seeking the downward slope that led towards the fjord, he stopped dead, his blood turning to ice in his veins, despite the frantic exertion. Ahead, through the dense swirl of the blizzard, he saw a light. Not the comforting warm yellow of a hearth fire, but a pale, sickly blue luminescence radiating softly from the direction of Thorfinn's valley. It was too steady, too cold to be human. It was the same unnatural, silent glow he had glimpsed momentarily in the depths of his own shattered longhouse, and it meant he was already too late. The unnatural light, that silent, lethal beacon, winked out as quickly as it had erupted, leaving only the crushing weight of the morkety darkness to swallow the ruins whole. Gunnar gripped the iron head of his axe until his knuckles turned bone white, the cold of the metal leaching every last bit of warmth from his hand. He was standing on the precipice of absolute annihilation, and the realization hit him like a frozen wave. The threat wasn't something that feared fire or sound. It operated in the terrifying, surgical quiet of the deep winter. He took the first agonizing step across the threshold, the packed snow crunching with a sound that felt deafening in the universal silence. The air inside the longhouse was wrong. It didn't smell of smoke or char, nor did it carry the coppery stench of fresh slaughter he knew so well from the Viking raids of his youth. Instead, the air was crystalline, sterile, and impossibly cold, colder than the 30-below gale raging outside. It felt like walking into the breath of the grave itself, a space where warmth simply ceased to exist, replaced by a vacuum of life. Gunnar's eyes, adjusted now to the gloom, scanned the destruction. Beams were splintered, not by fire or siege engine, but torn with impossible precision, sheared through the heartwood as if by a massive, invisible razor. And then he saw them, the bodies. They were strewn haphazardly, but not mutilated. They looked untouched, serene almost, still wearing their heavy wool tunics and furs. Yet, as he knelt beside the still form of his cousin, Olaf, a terrifying detail snapped into horrifying focus. Olaf was rigid, frozen solid in the posture of sleep, but the weight was wrong. Gunnar tentatively reached out and pushed the shoulder. The body rocked with the unnatural lightness of an empty cask. Frantically, he tore open the tunic, ignoring the immediate risk of further damage in the extreme cold. Beneath the layers, there was no blood, no wound, just dry, shriveled skin pulled tight over bone. Olaf was not merely dead. He had been perfectly, flawlessly drained. His life force, his very substance, had been siphoned out, leaving behind a brittle, hollow shell, an exquisite and terrifying sculpture of loss. This wasn't the work of men or beasts. This was something ancient, something that treated life not as food or an enemy, but as a consumable resource, a volatile essence to be extracted. He moved swiftly through the longhouse, checking the other victims: a grandmother, 3 small children, a laborer. Every single one was the same, intact on the outside, utterly vacant within. The realization drove the air from his lungs. They were fighting something that didn't leave tracks and didn't leave witnesses, only these horrifying effigies. His search led him toward the small, usually cheerful nook where the spinners worked. He noticed a slight movement, a tiny, terrified flicker of life, hidden beneath a pile of discarded hides. It was Lyra, the youngest child of Olaf's neighbor, no older than 4, huddled in a near catatonic state, her eyes wide discs reflecting the infinite night. Gunnar moved slowly, dropping his axe momentarily to appear less threatening, whispering reassurances in the ancient tongue of the north. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. When he gently pulled her out, her small body trembling uncontrollably, she pointed a tiny, frost-bitten finger toward the wreckage of the main hearth. Her voice, when it came, was a razor-thin whisper that cut through the silence like shards of ice. "The shadows," she breathed, her gaze fixed on the Balkan stone. The shadows drank the warm light. Gunnar followed her gaze. The hearthstones, usually warm even hours after the last fire died, were now coated in a thin, shimmering rime of frost, impossible indoors. And there, etched deeply into the soot-stained stone, were not carvings, but a burn, a perfect circular scar, impossibly dark, as if the shadow itself had been superheated and pressed into the rock. It was a signature, a mocking display of power left by a hunter that knew it had no need to hide its presence. The child's testimony confirmed the dreadful truth he had feared since finding the impossible tracks in the pass. This entity, whatever it was, weaponized the cold and consumed the light. It was the physical manifestation of the Fimble Winter's curse, drawing energy from the very life it extinguished, growing stronger with every silent, frozen death. And that silent glow he had seen, it wasn't a warning. It was the final, triumphant energy pulse of the entity completing its awful work. He needed to get out. The air itself felt corrosive, draining his own warmth and vitality just by breathing it. But he couldn't just flee. Lyra was proof that something could survive, provided it was small enough, silent enough, or maybe just lucky enough to be overlooked. He scooped the frail child into his heavy cloak, careful not to jostle her frozen limbs, feeling the terrifying weightlessness of the survivors of this attack. He had to find the others. There were still 3 other farmsteads scattered across the ravine, isolated pockets of humanity clinging desperately to life against the impossible odds of this winter. If this thing moved as silently and efficiently as it appeared, Those families were already sitting targets, waiting for the shadow to press its scorching brand onto their hearths. Gunnar realized his mission had changed from defense to desperate relay. He had to warn them, not with the sound of a horn, which would only attract the monster, but with the impossible speed of a desperate man running across frozen chaos. But how? Running across the exposed, wind-scoured ice fields was an invitation to instant death, either by the cold or by the unknown predator that moved like a whisper through the night. He looked back at Olaf's hollow shell, seeing the fate that awaited them all. The only way to fight a threat that consumed light was to become the ultimate shadow, to move outside the very boundary of visibility, trusting in the ancient frozen trails known only to the desperate. He turned his back on the ruins, the chilling, sterile air pushing him forward. He pulled the hood of his fur cloak down low, the tiny weight of Lyra against his chest, the only tether anchoring him to reality. The next farmstead, the home of the Skjold family, was 3 kilometers away, across the dreaded glacier of the Whispering Dead. It was a route no sane man took, even in summer. But now, under the cloak of the Murkatide, it offered the only cover from the predatory gaze of the impossible horror that now stalked the Scandinavian peaks. The hunt was on, and Gunnar was the unwilling bait, racing against a silent clock made of ice and stolen life. Gunnar's lungs were tearing, sharp, agonizing protests against the Hyperborean air as he vaulted over a snow-drifted tangle of frozen birch roots. He didn't look back, but the sensation of being tracked, of being herded, was a suffocating blanket draped over his shoulders. He felt the cold not just as a temperature, but as the calculated breath of the monster close behind him, manipulating the very environment to its advantage. His destination was the ice fissure, the Iskloft, a crack in the mountain's granite spine known only to the descendants of the first settlers, a place of last, desperate refuge. Every instinct shouted that running was futile, that the creature could close the distance in 3 silent strides. But it wasn't about speed, it was about placement. The horror wasn't chasing him, it was driving him toward a predetermined kill zone, using the contours of the frozen peaks and the thick, suffocating blackness of the Murkatide as its willing collaborators. The wind howled a chorus of ancient misery, stripping heat from his bones faster than his heart could pump the hot blood. He remembered the old, fearful tales spoken only near roaring fires. The Knotfoot, the Nightborn, a legend dismissed by younger men, but resurrected now by the impossible evidence of stolen lives and perfect, terrifying silence. Old Man Thord had described it as something that fed not on flesh, but on the warmth of life, leaving behind perfectly preserved husks, or, sometimes, leaving nothing at all, as if the victim had simply been erased from the timeline of the world. Gunnar plunged forward, the ground blurring beneath his worn leather boots, his mind fixated on the jagged outline of the granite overhang, the entrance to the Iskloft. He reached it, scrambling down the slick, ice-encrusted rock face, the sheer drop promising immediate death if his grip failed, but the alternative was far, far worse. He squeezed through the narrow opening, falling into the absolute, echoing silence of the Earth's interior. The air here was heavy, still, and thick with the scent of frozen minerals, and something else, something deeply metallic, like old, cold blood, yet chillingly clean, untouched by rot. Drawing his small, iron-headed hunting axe, Gunnar scraped flint against steel. The tiny, desperate spark struggled against the cave's primordial dampness, finally catching on a piece of dried moss he'd carried, casting a weak, flickering beacon against the cavern walls. And in that light, the truth of his despair was illuminated, stark and horrifying. His heart didn't just skip a beat. It recoiled entirely. Scrawled high on the sheer, unforgiving ice wall, far above where any man could stand, was a symbol. It was not runic. It was not a marker of human passage. It was a perfect, sickening spiral of ancient, deep blackness, carved not into the ice with a blade, but seemingly branded onto the surface, radiating a cold so profound it felt like a silent, trapped scream within the stone itself. This was not merely a refuge from the storm. It was a register, a kill tally. The creature hadn't chased him to this place. It had simply known that every frightened soul, every desperate animal, would retreat here to await its end. And then Gunnar saw the smaller detail, the true depth of the creature's calculated malice. Fixed to the ice by a sliver of sharpened bone was a tiny, frozen, perfect braid of human hair. It was pale gold, belonging to little Asta, the daughter of his neighbor, lost 3 winters ago in a blizzard that left no tracks. This was not merely an efficient predator. It was a collector, an intelligence that savored the terror and memorialized the loss. Gunnar extinguished the flame instantly, plunging the cavern back into a darkness far heavier and more sentient than the night outside. He couldn't stay. To wait was to surrender to a fate already catalogued. He had to use the creature's expectation against it. He knew the Iskloft had one other exit, a narrow, upward chimney, barely large enough for a slim man to squeeze through, leading directly to the higher, desolate slopes of the Jortelfjell, the Giant's Peak. A place where the thin air and brutal storms made life impossible. A place no sane man would willingly climb during the peak of Murketide. But sanity was the first offering demanded by this ancient game. Wedging his body against the ice-slicked stone, Gunnar began the desperate ascent. Every torn muscle, every scraped knuckle was a necessary tax on his survival. He was climbing towards the source of the dread, towards the very heart of the storm, towards the one place the shadow hunter might expect him to avoid. he had to gain altitude. He had to look down upon the killing ground to finally gain a glimpse, however fleeting, of the impossible shape that stalked them, even if that glimpse cost him his life. The valley's fate rested on the single, terrifying hope that the ancient predator expected him to be cunning, not suicidal. He scrambled upward, ignoring the icy tears streaming from his eyes, knowing that if the creature was already above him, waiting patiently, this chimney was simply leading him into its open, unseen maw. The peak offered only two things: exposure or a chance at vision. The rock face was not friendly. It was a glacier of granite, slick with frozen mist that sliced through his thick woolen gloves like needles of broken glass, demanding a tribute of pain for every inch gained. Every upward pull was a gamble against gravity, and worse, against the silent, crushing cold that promised to turn his muscles into brittle sticks if he paused for even a heartbeat. He pushed past the chimney lip, clawing desperately for purchase on the flat, wind-scoured stone of the ridgeline. The world snapped into terrifying, agonizing clarity, a view bought at the cost of his own immediate safety, a beacon screaming for attention in the blackness, utterly exposed against the wrath of the Morkatide. The wind immediately tried to peel him from the mountain, a physical, invisible fist slamming into his chest, forcing him down onto his belly, where the ice bit savagely through his layers of hide and wool. He didn't see the monstrous shadow he expected, no massive outline against the sickly yellow glow of the distant valley fires he sought to warn. Instead, he saw something far, far worse. Nothing at all. The plateau was clear, except for one impossible thing: a patch of snow, not disturbed by the meandering track of a beast, but surgically removed. It was a perfect, deep crescent, scored into the packed ice right at the cliff edge, as if something impossibly massive had used that single spot as a temporary fulcrum, a launching point, or a point of immediate, weightless rest, yet left no weight-bearing trace. The density of the snow here was ancient, packed hard as ceramic by centuries of freeze and thaw. Yet this crescent was cut with mechanical precision, revealing the raw, dark basalt beneath, untouched by the melt of summer suns. This was not the lair of a foraging bear, nor the clumsy resting place of a fabled Jotun. This was a position chosen for absolute tactical advantage, an observation post for the valley below, silent and unforgiving. The creature wasn't just walking the earth. It was leveraging the cruel verticality of the mountains in a way that defied every single law of natural movement known to man. It was landing or taking off from places where a human could barely stand upright, and it was doing so without leaving the telltale compression marks of immense mass, only this inexplicable, clean scrape. It hunted from above, and its strikes were vertical, sudden, and absolutely devastating. The realization sent a shudder of icy terror deeper than the Fimble winter chill into his bones. They weren't fighting a beast of the woods. They were facing a swift, silent judgment delivered straight from the sky. A predator that treated the world as its personal, three-dimensional hunting ground. He crawled forward on his belly, using his chin to steady his sight against the howling gale, straining to understand the geometry of the impossible strike. That crescent, it wasn't a print, it was a precise scrape, indicative of a braking mechanism or an anchoring talon of unimaginable strength and razor sharpness. And then he saw it, frozen into the rough stone, just inches from the empty crescent. A single, black, impossibly thin strand. Maybe a hair, maybe something far more grotesque. Shivering faintly in the relentless wind, he reached out with cautious, trembling fingers. It was not soft fur, it was chitinous, hard, and faintly luminescent under the harsh, cold moonlight, reflecting the starlight with the cold, dead sheen of polished obsidian. It felt wrong, utterly alien, nothing catalogued in the Norse sagas, where the folklore of the deep mountain passes. It was the biological debris of an impossibility. He pulled a tiny, razor-sharp iron knife from his boot sheath, carefully scraping the shard free, wrapping it immediately in a piece of oiled leather, salvaged from a broken fishing lure. Proof. They needed undeniable proof before the others would consent to abandon the ancestral farmsteads and flee into the suicidal uncertainty of the deep forest roots. But looking down the sheer, terrifying drop, the distance to the valley floor felt infinite, a yawning gulf of black air and swirling snow. The lights of the nearest farmstead, the very settlement he was trying to save, were nothing more than miserable, struggling pinpricks, swallowed by the swirling, vengeful darkness of the longest night. There was absolutely no time for a safe, calculated descent. He had seen the evidence of the creature's breathtaking speed. Another strike could happen before he was halfway down the treacherous slope, and his own survival was secondary to the warning. He knew the rules of mountain signaling. 3 smokes in rapid succession meant immediate, catastrophic danger. The signal for absolute abandonment. He still carried the remains of his ascent torch, a tightly packed, resin-soaked bundle of dried birch bark and spruce needles. But holding a fire on this exposed peak was like trying to light a dry leaf inside a fully formed tornado. The wind would extinguish it instantly. Or worse, the flash might attract the very thing he was trying desperately to warn against, marking him as the highest, most immediate target. He had to shield it, but the peak offered no natural shelter, only naked, hostile stone and the screaming void of the atmosphere. His only protection was his own body, a fragile, living windbreak against the terrifying fury of the Fimble winter's breath, a sacrifice waiting to happen. Kneeling low, his cloak flapping violently, like the clipped wings of a trapped raven. He gathered a small, precious handful of dry moss from a hidden, deep crevice. Moss that had miraculously survived the impossible, years-long freeze. He struck his fire steel. The sharp, desperate shower of sparks immediately trying to fly sideways into the abyss, refusing to catch. The first spark caught, sputtered, and died, instantly drowned by a sudden gust that tasted bitterly of ice and grave dust, mocking his effort. He tried again, shielding the fragile ember with both hands cupped tightly, his breath held tight in his lungs until his vision swam with black, nauseating spots, pushing himself to the point of collapse. Catch, damn you, catch. The resin finally sighed, catching hold with a fierce, angry crackle, fueled by his terrified desperation. The first smoke signal, thin and sickly white, was immediately visible against the coal-black expanse of the sky, a fragile prayer sent into the void. He held the torch high for only a few seconds, knowing the fatal risk of lingering. Then he slammed it down, extinguishing the light instantly against the ice. He quickly prepared the second bundle, his frozen fingers fumbling with the binding cords, moving with a manic, urgent speed. The air felt different now, impossibly heavy and thick around him. The wind had not died down, but the sound had changed. It was no longer a natural roar, but a deep, vibrating hum, a low-frequency resonance that settled deep in his chest cavity like a malignant, growing heartbeat, threatening to shake his teeth loose. He slammed the steel against the flint, desperate for the second signal, but the immediate, terrifying change in the atmosphere confirmed his greatest, paralyzing fear. The creature knew he was here. The brief, reckless flash of light had registered in its impossible, alien senses, and it was already moving toward the source. The second smoke flared high, thick and dark this time, a beacon of immediate, undeniable peril, a column of fear. As the smoke column rose, momentarily blocking out the indifferent starlight, he heard it. Not a sound from the distant valley, but a horrifying tear in the air directly above the peak. A sound like a wet hide being ripped, as if the very fabric of the night itself had been brutally shredded open. He threw himself flat against the unforgiving stone, scrambling backwards toward the relative safety of the chimney chute, the burning bundle tossed carelessly into the snow to die, its job done. He had only managed 2 signals, not the crucial 3, but the message was clear enough, screaming down the mountainside. Run. Now. He didn't wait to see the inevitable, impossible shape descending from the zenith, the apex of the night sky. He only felt the pressure drop violently, the sudden, terrifying vacuum of air being displaced by something massive, impossibly fast, and descending straight toward the exposed point where he had just stood, a breath ago. The air pressure change wasn't just a rush. It was a brutal, physical punch that knocked the breath from Cale's lungs and threw him sideways into the hardened snowdrift he had been racing past, scraping skin raw against the ice crust. The sound that followed was not merely the snap of wood, but the deep, sickening crack of ancient granite protesting against an unimaginable, instantaneous force. A resonant, chest-shattering boom that swallowed all other noise in the dark valley, leaving a vacuum of pure, deafening shock. He scrambled desperately, vision swimming in blurry streaks of white and black, the fine, crystalline ice stinging his eyes as he fought to orient himself. His lungs burned with the inhaled cold, every muscle fiber screaming in overloaded panic. Where the towering, centuries-old pine had stood just milliseconds earlier, its dark silhouette a landmark against the swirling snow, there was now only a smoking, jagged stump, ripped clean and driven down into the permafrost like a broken, oversized tooth. The impact crater was immense, a raw, black void torn violently in the pristine white landscape, steaming slightly in the lethal negative-degree cold as the pulverized earth met the air. Whatever had struck had done so with the concentrated kinetic energy of a meteor, a weight and speed that defied every known law of the natural world. Yet there was no lingering roar, no heavy, lumbering sound of retreat, just the abrupt, terrifying silence returning, now thicker, heavier, and infinitely colder than before. Cale tasted ash and metallic fear, his ears ringing so violently he thought his skull might split, realizing with chilling certainty that his life had been spared by less than the width of a single breath, a mere phantom fraction of a second that separated him from being utterly pulverized into the icy earth alongside the tree. He did not wait to inspect the impossible damage further. He turned and ran, powered by a primal terror that screamed at him only one command: reach the safety of the thick timber walls, or die. He launched himself across the final few meters, throwing his body against the heavy oak door, shouting a guttural warning that was immediately muffled by the wood and the raging wind outside. The thick wooden bar dropped into place with a shuddering final thud that echoed ominously in the sudden interior quiet, a sound that felt less like security and more like a massive tomb being irrevocably sealed against the outside world. Inside, the meager, flickering light cast by the central hearth danced nervously across the faces of the remaining farmstead inhabitants, faces pale with utter exhaustion, fear distilled into a potent poison, and the dawning horrific comprehension of the absolute monstrosity that was hunting them down one by one. Children, woken violently by the seismic impact, whimpered deep into their mothers' protective furs, and even the stoutest, most battle-hardened warriors clutched their heavy axes with white knuckles, their eyes constantly flickering toward the heavy window shutters, expecting the reinforced wood to burst inward at any second under impossible, crushing pressure. Old Inger, the village elder, whose beard was thin and gray like frozen lichen, stared blankly into the hypnotic flames, muttering desperate prayers to forgotten gods of ice and stone, deities older than the common Aesir, hoping to invoke a primal protection that modern faith had abandoned. The great beast was outside now. They knew it absolutely, intuitively. They didn't see it, for the darkness was too profound and the blizzard too thick, but they felt its presence, a palpable, crushing weight pressing against the very atmosphere, a profound coldness that seeped through the stone foundation, despite the roaring, greedy fire within the longhouse. It wasn't pacing like a common wolf or circling aggressively like a territorial bear. It was waiting, silently testing the defenses, assessing the pitiful fragility of their wooden cage with calculated patience. Then came the sound, a noise that instantly chilled their blood to stagnation, stopping every heart for a paralyzing moment. A slow, deliberate, scraping sound, unnaturally high above the swirling snow line, suggesting immense, razor-sharp claws dragging across the very roof ridge, searching for purchase on the thick sod and heavy thatch. It was exploring their sanctuary with intelligent, calculated malice, not merely reacting with brute, unthinking hunger. Gunnar, the farmstead's best hunter, a man whose courage in the face of bears and raiding parties was legendary across the valley, pointed a trembling finger upward toward the heavy central ceiling beams. A thin, cold stream of fine, powdery roof snow began to drift down near the chimney flue, followed almost immediately by something else, something dark, oily, and impossibly large, striking the dirt floor with a soft, heavy clatter. It was a scale. Not the scale of any fish or any serpent they knew from the fjords or forests, but a massive shard of chitinous armor, jagged and thick as a man's thumb at its base, reflecting the firelight with an unsettling obsidian gleam that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. It was utterly alien in material, possessing a faint, coppery electrical odor that made the two farm dogs huddled in the corner growl low, deep in their chests, and then suddenly fall completely silent, paralyzed into instant instinctual dread, recognizing a predator far beyond their comprehension. "We cannot stay here," Cale finally declared, his voice raw and cracked, cutting through the suffocating silence. "Whatever this thing is, thick wood and hard stone will not hold it indefinitely. It toyed with us. It demonstrated its power, but it didn't even use its full strength. We must prepare immediately to abandon the longhouse and attempt the mountain path before it settles in for a final, inescapable siege." But the mountain path was universally acknowledged suicide in this blizzard, a route guaranteed to bury them under meters of morkatied snowdrifts, where the footing was treacherous and visibility non-existent. They were trapped definitively between the slow, agonizing fury of the ancient winter and the swift, unimaginable cruelty of the unseen predator that now encircled their final, failing haven. They began the desperate work of reinforcing the weakest points, stacking every movable object, heavy grain sacks, barrels of salted meat, massive logs, against the thickest walls, hoping that any of it might absorb the shock of an inevitable breach, delaying the inevitable by mere minutes. They sharpened every blade until the edges shone like polished ice, knowing that even if the final attack came, their resistance would be merely a final, desperate plea for a quick end, rather than any realistic hope of victory. The exterior pressure intensified sharply. A sudden, seismic thump against the eastern log wall sent violent tremors through the entire structure, rattling the pots on the rack, shaking the very earth beneath their feet, and extinguishing one of the smaller, precious tallow lamps. It was testing the perimeter again, not yet striking to kill, but delivering a calculated psychological blow, reminding them that their destruction was merely delayed, not averted in any meaningful sense. The air within the longhouse grew noticeably heavy, thick with the smell of wet earth and charged ozone. The creature was close enough now for them to hear its breathing, a deep, grating inhalation and exhalation that sounded like vast continental glaciers shifting under unbearable pressure, slow, powerful, and utterly indifferent to the small, fragile lives huddled within. The true psychological horror wasn't the imminent physical attack itself, but the chilling realization that this entity was capable of intricate thinking, of playing with its food, drawing out the suspense and the fear until the victims had fully marinated in their own exquisite despair. They were not fighting a mindless beast driven solely by immediate hunger. They were being hunted by something that understood terror as its most effective and lethal weapon. Cale gripped his axe, the cold steel a small comfort against his sweaty palm, looking at the terrified, wide eyes of his remaining family members in the dim light. He knew the sun would not rise for weeks yet. They were trapped in eternal night, and somewhere just beyond the thick timber, the thing waited, its massive shadow blotting out the faint, distant glow of the highest stars. They had survived the strike, but the siege had just begun in earnest.